But what I think is interesting about what it's about to take us through is this idea about infrastructure in Africa and technology. I think it's really pertinent. There's lots of like Silicon Valley companies who are talking about kind of setting up in Africa, like Jack Dorsey's building stuff there, Google's building stuff there. In lots of discussions I've been having with academics at SOAS, so much of their research is focused on Africa, so many conferences are there. And I think it's interesting to see whether or not that's exploitative or if it's moving in a good direction, and what the kind of pros and cons are of a lack of infrastructure, but also what issues can arise if there's too much. So yeah, I'm excited about hearing about Maxwell's research. So Maxwell, over to you.
Hi. Just making sure everything's clear. Let me just grab some headphones. Thanks for this. I'm very, very excited. It's actually been a really fun day because a lot of what I think, I hope there. How's the sound? Can I get a thumbs up? Thank you, Charlene. Yeah, no, it was really, really fun. I mean, everything from like earlier on with your conversation with Rashid, I really was very interested in that. So I will speak to this idea of automation, but really thinking about how taking the example, say, the Industrial Revolution, to sort of say before the Industrial Revolution, there was industrialized labor. But let me just start with an introduction. I am Maxwell Mutanda. I'm calling in, I wouldn't say I'm in transit, but I am really. I'm in Harare, Zimbabwe, making my way to Germany soon, so I will be in the diaspora. I am dark-skinned with full lips, big eyes, a big nose, and a big afro. I'm wearing round spectacles and a white shirt with horizontal blue stripes. And I'm standing in front of a quite plain background with some light switches behind me. So let me get to the share screen. I am mindful of the fact that one of these shouldn't, how do I do that thing where I sort of say don't present? Oh, skip slide. There you go. So I'll go to the beginning. I'll go back to Zoom. I'll do screen share. So what I do want to do is start with a video, which I will play. Oh, hold on, I didn't follow Louise's instructions, which were to click. Yeah, click.
Don't want to be so baby.
Okay, especially because I'm with headphones, hopefully the sound will come in. So I'm going to start with this video I did, which sort of takes us back pre-technology, which really is more an idea of colonization, I think. And Charlene mentioned something that I think will reoccur, this idea of not so much borrowing, but really thinking about the conversations that are being had on different sides of the Atlantic, right? So in the Americas, for me, it was in Europe, and then also on the continent. So here we go. I can't see anyone, but if someone just puts a thumbs up on the reactions, just to make sure sound is playing. Well, I mean, when I start to press play. Thanks, Louise. Here we go.
As far as I'm concerned, since we met you people 500 years ago, look at us. We've given everything. You are still taking. From the Africans. It's true. I mean, where would the whole Western world be without Africa? Our cocoa, our timber, our gold, our diamonds, our platinum, our whatever. Everything you are is us. I am not saying it, it's a fact. And in return for all of this, what have we got? Nothing. anti-personnel indoctrination against ourselves. If you go and cook your horrible diseases like AIDS, you say it is us. You brought us tuberculosis. We didn't have this big cough until white people came here. In exchange for Africa giving Europe 500 solid years of our people, I mean, not Europe, the Western world, of our human beings to work your canes, to dig your gold, to taking gold itself, diamond, I mean, fish, peanuts, palm oil, everything. In exchange for that, we have got nothing. Nothing. And you know it. Nothing. And you look upon, white folks look upon us like monkeys. It is true. It's in your literature. Hey, some of your best thinkers have said this about us. Have you heard of all these Germans? Have you heard?
Okay.
Yes. They said Lord Burton, yes. People like that. They said we don't even have the brain of animals. That's what we've got from you people.
But don't you think that this is over now?
Over where? Is it over? Who said that AIDS came from the green monkey? Is it over?
Okay, so exit full screen, and then we can start. So yeah, hectic stuff. But I do like this interview. It's the text is from an interview with a Ghanaian author. Her name is Ama Ata Aidosh, and it was with a Norwegian television station, NRK. And it's sort of like, I don't know, it really kind of haunted me over the summer, and obviously it came up like a lot on, say, like the Twitter feeds, and I think even Burna Boy featured a bit of it in a music video. So it was just like, how can I react to this and really think about my work through this sort of lens of racial capitalism. So I'll start with a quick acknowledgement also, just I-Beam features today a little bit. And so I'm grateful for a grant from them and from the Graham Foundation, and also fellowship with Akademische Solitude in Stuttgart. So that's the video. I'll skip that if I can. So one of the things that is my work currently is focused on is on this idea of platform urbanism. I have a background in architecture, which I think is important to state. So really, I'm looking at this idea of like a bifurcated reality between the digital and the physical. I like to say cyberspace with the cyber in parenthesis, because we are kind of living in this augmented reality. Our lives are very much defined by both our physical and digital experience. And so this work really speaks to this idea of particularly food ordering and delivery platforms in sub-Saharan Africa, but how that really relates to the whole world. And one of the things I think was important for me is drawing on this idea of political imaginaries, right? These imagined or imaginative geographies, drawing on Edward Said's concept, and really, they're defined as referring to the perception of a space created through certain imagery, text, and/or discourses. So in this context, the imaginary is not a made-up lie or a fiction. It is more synonymous with perception. So for me, imagined geographies are often constructed on a national level as political action. And I think anyone from the continent can really understand this through the guise of liberation. So in Zimbabwe, it's really thinking of the Lancaster House Agreement, which really set up the nation state of Zimbabwe, right? Which was a document, which was an act, it was a summit in London, but it's sort of synonymous with, say, the the Freedom Charter in South Africa, which really sets up this idea of rights and ownership. And I think something that really comes to the mind for a lot of people is, say, the Constitution in the United States, right? Which really is something that is quite, I wouldn't say abstract, but it's this national document, but it really invades domestic space. Because if you think of, say, the single family home, it's really emblematic of the American dream, right? And so these intimate spaces, such as those of our smartphones, can have with them this idea of the beguiling promise of progress. But at the same time, I think it's really important to think about the future in relation to where do you view the future from. So there's this really well-known view from Joseph Voros of a future code, which sort of points to us starting from a singular present and all the different possibilities of the future. But for me, it's like, well, we're not at a singular present with multiple or probable outcomes. We really exist in these multiplicities, right? And so pictured here is an image of District 9, which was a film from South Africa, which was a science fiction film, which really kind of played to this idea of an apartheid-like state, right? Where these aliens land on Earth in Johannesburg, and it really replicates a past. Previously, I'd shown a slide featuring the actor Tom Cruise and Samantha Morton from the film Minority Report. And so our view of the future really is kind of dominated by these Western ideas, say from Isaac Asimov or Philip K. Dick, but really they are many, many views of the future coming from many, many different presents. And so I put this in because of like Gloria and Marcy's conversation now, really thinking of this idea of, you know, they are Black people in the future, you know, really where do different identities sit? So for me, it really is this idea of design as an agent of change, and using narrative as a way to develop design and hopefully influence newer and fairer realities, right? Again, my background in architecture predetermines technology normally as a medium, right? So as a way to draw. So the work that I'll primarily be sharing thinks of design technology and design and its consequences on the urban and the city. So I'll start with a project that I did a while back called Dollar Vans, which was this urban mapping project developed to look at the transit network within Harare, but really within any city, speaking really to informality. So if I think about conversations that we've had today about infrastructure, I think one of the things that I'm very mindful of is how our view of infrastructure should really take into consideration the realities of infrastructure as it stands now. So what do I mean by that? So it's not like the giant infrastructure, but the everyday infrastructure that people create. So anyone who knows the continent will be familiar with informal urban settlements. And really, it's not something that's at the periphery, but it's something that's central to cities. Most cities are dominated by informal urbanism. And so transit in Africa is also dominated by informal transit networks. So I came at this with this idea of thinking of the London Underground map, really this 1931 diagrammatic depiction of the network in London and how this could be translated to my city, Harare, you know, where transport is dominated by minibuses that take about 12 people. And it's really a change from sort of the colonial heritage of the city, where we did have a parastatal called Zipco, which was this bus company. It had about 1,200 buses and operated about 426 routes. So today, commuter minibuses are licensed by the state and local authorities, but efforts to accommodate them into the fabric of the city are quite miserable, really because of the sort of vision of the city that we have, which is determined by colonial bureaucracy. So dollar vans was a way to think about the importance and ingenuity of a system that already exists, that a lot of people, not just in Harare, but all over the continent and all over the world, use to get to school, work, or otherwise. So this was an initial kind of provocation, looking at Cape Town on the left and Harare on the right. And so the screen is showing a video from Google Maps to try and do this wayfinding from my homes in either city to get to the airport. And Cape Town gives you these many, many different options, right, of how to get there, either by public transit, or either by Uber or walking. And in Harare, that information wasn't there. So initially, I thought about filling that gap, but then drew back from that later on because of this idea of the ownership of information, which is something interesting. So, well, how it started really was thinking about this idea of collecting this geolocation data. So it's called General Transit Feed Specification, and it's something that Google actually bought. And the project really was using this third-party Android app that allowed us to gather the information using volunteers, mapping out 58 unique routes and taking about 300 trips around the city. So like I said, if you live in Africa, you know that people get around using minibuses, even in Cape Town, which has this sort of city-initiated bus rapid transit system. To this day, at least 60% of public transit that people use is through minibuses. And these taxis are small, they ferry about 15 to 25 people at a time, and they're low cost, and they're adaptive. And so one of the other provocations was looking at this article from the New Yorker that highlighted that even within New York City, this form of transit can be considered the 7th largest public transport network within the Americas. And so who uses it? Predominantly non-white immigrant people. So you have a lot of transit connecting immigrant Chinese nationals to Chinatown, where they predominantly work. And those buses are even operated in Mandarin, and they're really specific to the community. And on a side note, it's really interesting to think about how capitalism really looks for ways to infiltrate. So there was an app that was created called Chariot, which was an app-based shuttle service that tried to replicate the design of this model as an Uber-inspired micro-transit tech company. The company eventually got bought by Ford for about $65 million, but collapsed. I mean, it's so interesting for me to think about this. So here's a view of some of the routes and the data that was collected as a map. And here's the data as text. And then from there, sort of mapped out these routes. And then really in doing it, seeing the city and the routes as existing on the face of a clock. So it was a whole bunch of routes. I will skip through this if I can, to show the full map of Harare with all the routes mapped on, showing where they intersected, numbering them again, as I said, thinking of a clock, so from 1 to 12 as prefixes, and how they all congregate at the center, and how they overlap. And seeing here on this map, you see the dotted lines that show how the routes adapt to meet people's needs. So one of the things, drawing it back to the current work, it was really seeing the couriers that facilitate platform urbanism as this network, right? So looking at those arteries and considering what do these arteries mean within the wider conversation of digital media and infrastructure. And through the lens of capitalism, or specifically the reproduction of capitalism. I like to say this thing that, you know, colonial capitalism survives, colonial geographies are pernicious. Even now, you know, as many herald the so-called fourth industrial revolution, it is ever more apparent that the internet is not egalitarian, right? Social and economic inequalities characterize capitalism today as much as they did in the past. So there's this quote that I love from Martin Luther, the 16th century German theologian, that says, "An earthly kingdom cannot exist without inequality of persons. Some must be free, some serfs, some rulers, some subjects." So it's really, okay, taking this present and past reality, how do we imagine a better digital future? How does one deploy philosophy, poetics, and the strategies from organized labor of infiltration and ratification to address the subjugation of both the physical and virtual realms of changing cities? So in keeping with this idea from Wodowski, who was an architectural historian, of an architecture that isn't for merchant princes and princes of blood. So really, the way I think about the work is really, it's a non-Western redress to the colonized gaze and serfdom of the mobile phone economy, which perpetuates historic land appropriation, discrimination, displacement, and containment. So on the screen now is 3 iterations of a map of Africa that shows undersea data cables. And here's just another version of those maps looking at the future projection of the development of undersea cables now and up to 2023. So it's really, for me, I'm really preoccupied with this growing necessity to broaden and re-examine architecture and design and its past in relation to the present day rapid urbanization and consequently present and new histories. So in short, how do the inherent histories of society built with existing social mores transform into cooperative societies or fraternal societies that someone like Aimé Césaire speaks of? So especially within the global south, right? There's this orthodox interpretation of smart urbanism and platform urbanism as something that is synonymous with reordered cities or the alleviation of social and economic inequality. So the investment and the instruction to make cities smart has really indiscriminately pervaded local and national governments. So it's interesting to see this happening. So all this development, particularly of undersea data cables to Africa, is something that happened post 2008 with the global financial crisis, right? It was just really a way of money is like water, right? It finds its level. And so it really found its way to Africa. And one of the things that I think is really important for me here is the work of people like Mark Graham and the Oxford Internet Institute that really speak specifically to labor practices within platform geographies. And I really think about how this intersects with our physical environments. So now they've laid this map that shows a railway line and a telegraph line from Salisbury, which is present-day Harare, to Mutare. And it really is like looking at those connections from the past into the present to understand, how the hidden wealth of these systems really comes from this idea of industrialized labor. So right now you'll see a slide flicking through this photographic series called Invasive Species by the South African photographer Dylan Marsh, which showcases cellular towers disguised as trees. And concealing cellular towers in this manner, they're given the name monopalms. And South Africa has a distinction of having one of the world's first artificial palm trees. But they've existed since the early 90s in the US and elsewhere. So it really is important for me that designers consider how the hidden economic value chains and spatial consequences of Silicon Valley urbanism are subsidized by this ever-evolving exploitation of a patchwork tapestry of public, private, and insecurely governed streetscapes and urban spaces, particularly for me by immigrant workforce of dislocated Africans, as opposed to just a large-scale development, say, of data cables or cellular towers. And when one thinks of infrastructure, I think it's also important to think of the cost of the internet, right? So this was from 2019, which looked at the average cost of 1 gigabyte of mobile data around the world by a comparison website based in the UK, because, you know, who else loves comparison websites? And so Cable looked at every country, or 120 countries, and at the time, Zimbabwe had the highest internet cost. And in general, sub-Saharan Africa is quite expensive, but it's also interesting to see that the US is also quite expensive in this regard. India has the cheapest at less than 30 cents. And hold on. I can see the chat. I don't know if this affects the your view. Louise, can you just give me a quick thumbs up? This is my first time being able to see the chat as I go along, which I'm excited about.
Laughing at your comment about comparison websites. It's not important, don't worry.
Okay, so for me, it's really this idea of a trans-historical investigation, right? So the advent of mobile telephony is particularly important in sub-Saharan Africa, as opposed to everywhere else, because digital communications developed where access to landline phones was previously scarce or even non-existent. So in this regard, the Internet of Things proliferates in Africa at the same time that it perpetuates structural violence, right, of social and economic inequality. An example of this is this great work out of Congo. God, I'll have to look up the name. Where I think less than 3% of people in Congo are online, right? But the majority of those people are men, right? And it's really something that I'm very mindful of, because as I look to platform urbanism, a majority of the drivers are men. And so it really is, again, I do like this idea of power geometries, which I'll speak to soon. But it's like the difference between gender, the difference between race, the difference between the digital and the physical. All of these things really come through. So for me, learning, or more specifically unlearning, requires one to explore multiple temporalities in a trans-historical manner, essentially providing an anthropological cut through the present day and future time. You know, a vivisection that opens up space for world building that is asynchronous, but considers all these multiple geographies that I've mentioned through technology, urbanism, capitalism, labor, gender, etc., at the same time. So here's an example that I think is also quite interesting. Again, speaking to this idea of really what is infrastructure. So for me, it's really important there's a really great quote from the architects, educators, writers, Venturi Scott Brown, which speaks to learning from the existing landscape as a way of being revolutionary for an architect. Not the obvious way, which is to tear down Paris and begin again, as Le Corbusier suggested in the 1920s, but another more tolerant way, that is to question how we look at things. So pictured here are students in Libya doing their exams during the power cut, during the heat, obviously, of the environment, and during the current COVID pandemic. And they're using their cell phones as a way to light their work because of the failure of local municipality grids, right? So for me, even though the systemization of daily life was quite well established in colonial cities by European settlers, you know, for example, trash was picked up on, say, a Tuesday. We used to have milkmen that would come about every day, you know, their glass bottles ringing like bells as they pushed their carts along the street, or the street lights would be lit by 5, really all that has really changed because of this sort of collision of an established idea of infrastructure and the predominant infrastructure that has developed after years of discrimination and exclusion within the city. So, you know, Zimbabwe has a lot of really tall, slender street lamps, but really they just are sort of like these sentinels without a purpose, right? Because electricity in most African cities is marred by rolling blackouts due to shortages of power generation as more and more people urbanize. So although the urban electrification rate nominally stands at 68% and drops to 25% in rural areas, it is not uncommon to see streetlights that are lit during the day or not lit at all. And so you get this situation as pictured here, where you see 4 men walking in Harare at night, and 2 of them are using their cell phones again, as this idea of a disconnected or dislocated infrastructure network to light their way at night. I just want to quickly touch on this interesting development of how the largest mobile network in Zimbabwe has been trying to meet that gap by sort of being the largest buyer of Tesla batteries to meet the needs of their cell phone towers, because obviously they were running on diesel generators, which financially is unsustainable for them, and perhaps speaks to this fact of the cost of internet in Zimbabwe. So it's not a resource that one can consider to be readily available, but it's also super expensive for these many reasons. So I spoke to this idea of power geometries, which is a term introduced by the feminist geographer Doreen Massey, which speaks to spatiality and mobility as things that can be both shaped by and reproduce power differentials in society. So examples might include the control over the distribution of goods and services, or the different circuits enabled by transportation systems, or the system of digital networks. So for me, this is something that's really important within the analysis of digital space, how the spatial practices of low-wage itinerant digital platform workers really sets up this this difference in powers, because really they are facilitating a network by the way that they utilize the interstitial spaces of the city. And how is this really reproducing the political and economic history of legislated land misappropriation, discrimination, displacement, and containment that is pervasive not only in the post-colony, but in most cities. And a way of really thinking about this colonial segregation and this statutory tenure systems for, say, our North American participants is thinking about redlining or similar racially restrictive covenants, right? Which really set up a system in which Black people could only live or work in certain parts of the city. And really this is how informality developed, right? Because people had no legal recourse to land. And so their system of creating space for themselves really became usurpatory, right? It just set up their own sort of customary easement rights within communities that were outside of systems that dominate. So, I skipped ahead, which is fine, no biggie. But so one of the things that's also important for me to really think about is how when one thinks of, say, the material culture of couriers, it really doesn't perpetuate this history of, say, the milkman, or pictured here is a bicycle from the cooperative society, which, you know, has this pannier at the front, because really each of these individual couriers has to develop their own pannier system. It really is how informality isn't just like this large-scale urban phenomena, but really is also something that influences the intimate actions of an individual courier who supports a large-scale global corporation, right? And so, you know, this really brings to mind for me this differential that Claude Levi-Strauss speaks about between the bricklayer and the engineer, which, I mean, it's always very interesting for me to think about like work. So I will confess to being a little bit academic. I'm currently doing a master's at the University of Oxford in sustainable urban development. So forgive like some of the very sort of theoretical references. But, you know, it's really, you know, there's this idea of seeing the city, or if one thinks of The Right to the City from Henri Lefebvre, it really is, again, a Western idea of how the city is divided, right? And, you know, like within the translation notes of Lefebvre's book, what is it called? The Savage Mind, I think. You know, they speak to the bricklayer as having, you know, no, as a professional do-it-yourself man, and you know, a jack of all trades, doing odd jobs. But really, for me, it's going away from this bifurcation, the difference, but really seeing our present as something that is dominated by both the informal and formal. Oh, sorry, I have to go back to the slide. So really, you know, the way that the material culture of the motorcycles developed is something that's also quite interesting for me. On the left, currently, you see Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck on a Vespa in the 1953 movie Roman Holiday, juxtaposed to this diagram of the Honda Super Club. So this idea of the motorcycle, or how can one really speak to it? I don't want to say moped. What's another word for Vespa? Anyway, is quite romantic in one sense, but let's be honest, it's a white sense. So when Honda first launched this particular motorcycle, that really is sort of one of the models for delivery motorcycles. It was through this campaign that said, you meet the nicest people on a Honda. And it really sort of perpetuated this very sort of white middle class view, which was antithetical to the way in which really it's used. So now you have this idea of, you know, this is an interesting one for me, which is from the advertising agency McCann, which sort of sets up this difference between, say, a super bike and a delivery bike as one between a midlife crisis and a midnight crisis. And in the corner, they say delivery until 4 a.m. And really is, how does one, you know, a lot of people see these things, again, back to this idea of automation, but really what is automation? You know, the history of automation really is a history of just of labor, right? So if one thinks back to, like, Amazon currently has this service, which they developed for themselves and they ended up selling, which is called Amazon Turk, which stems from this mechanical Turk within history, which was meant to showcase sort of like an early robot. But what it was really was a man inside of a box moving an automaton. So for me, with, you know, in contrast to this history that stems from, say, Roman Holiday, or seeing this idea of scooters through Vespas, it really is thinking about how the couriers really perpetuate this idea of porterage that came about through the expedition of the continent. So pictured here is a scene from the British East Africa expedition on the right. And then on the left is an image of Sir Henry Morgan Stanley, of David Livingstone fame, with his courier, a porter, a young man called Kalulu, and how really this history is replicated within our present day through the way in which platforms are two-sided, right? It's always interesting, I think, that a lot of people don't realize that there are two screens to a platform. There are always two screens to Deliveroo, to Uber, or anything. The screen of the quote-unquote user and the people who facilitate that, right? And in that, you see this discrimination being perpetuated within the digital realm. This is going to be fun because I know, this land tenure. I love land tenure. So I'm just going to speak to this relationship, land tenure, and just read this definition from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which speaks to land tenure as a relationship, whether legally or customarily defined among people as individuals or groups with respect to land. For convenience sake, land is used here to include natural resources such as water and trees. Land tenure is an institution, that is to say, rules invented by societies to regulate behavior. Rules of tenure define how property rights to land are to be allocated within society. They define how access is granted to rights to use, control, and transfer land, as well as associated responsibilities and restraints. In simple terms, land tenure system determines who can use what resources for how long and under what condition. So, how does this relate to the work that I do? As I'll show later, a lot of couriers, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but even within urban landscapes, say in London or anywhere in Europe or the US, have no space allocated for them within the city. They really use leftover spaces, right? So your delivery drivers will be waiting, say, outside a McDonald's for someone to order food. And it really is looking at those spaces and this phenomenon as how are as a workplace. And so what does that workplace mean, and how is that workplace mediated by digital infrastructure? So here is ongoing work that I'm doing that looks at the history of land tenure on the continent, specifically post-independence. So I really like, if you can see on the left, there's a long line coming from the top of all the countries that gained independence in 1960. But the whole graph charts the nation states and territories on the continent, and how land tenure has been defined pre-independence by colonial structures and post-independence as a way to, again, show control. So when the video starts, it'll show you all the different countries. So on the top is Angola, going all the way down to Zimbabwe, which is Z. And one of the things that I try and show in this is also the history of conflict and the fact that ideas of tenure lead to conflict and are also reproduced during conflict. So obviously a way of thinking about war and conflict isn't just the differences between people, but it really is a fight for resources, specifically on the continent that is quite rich. So that's a quick one. I'll quickly skip ahead to this idea of, which I really like, a quote from David Graeber, this idea of play is the ultimate expression of freedom for its own sake. And so even as serious as this work is, I think a lot of the things that I try to do within how I think about it and reproduce it. So currently it's like through gamification. So it really is like, how can I show all of this information through, say, software like Unity as a way to move through it. And Yeah, I will just quickly show this, which is a view of Cape Town, in particular Hout Bay, and an informal settlement called Imaginaries, which again contrasts this difference between informal urbanism and obviously predominantly or historically white residential neighborhoods, again between high income and low income communities, and thinking about the history of architecture as something that perpetuates this as well. So informality is something that is really quite important to me. As I said, most of Africa, more than 50% of cities in Africa and in the global south really are dominated by informal urbanism, but also informal practices. So in Zimbabwe, we had this sort of weird statistic where the informal economy is considered to be anywhere between 40 to 90% of the GDP of the country. And if one looks at, say, Nigeria, which is the largest economy in Africa, one of the reasons why it finally got that recognition was because of this consideration of the informal economy. For the longest time, South Africa was considered the powerhouse, but it is very Western-centric in its banking, for example, whereas the rest of Africa uses a lot of mobile banking. South Africa doesn't. And these systems that we have developed should be something that, and is something now that is very much considered as part of the wider GDP of any country. And for me, it's really thinking about also platforms as having exploited this informality, because really essentially what is Airbnb but a way of people to find new ways of formalizing their house sharing, flat sharing, subletting, etc. And if I think of transit, I think a good example for me is BlaBlaCar, which is an app out of France, which initially developed really as a way for people who are hitchhiking between cities to find other people traveling there and subsidize the fuel payments. And so I think something that Rashid and Charlene spoke to was this idea of automation. And really, it is really thinking about how the present day or future digital geographies reproduce this industrialization or mechanization of colonial capitalism, which, as Rashid mentioned, dehumanizes human labor and labels it as automation, and for me, there's a really great influence, although he's currently very controversial, Louis Hyman, who does a lot of research on the industrious revolution that preceded automation. And as I mentioned before, how really within the 18th and 19th century, if it wasn't the fact that people were industrialized, that people got agglomerated into factories or onto plantations, were we able to have this industrial revolution? And I think that's a really important way to think of the current so-called fourth industrial revolution, which is mediated by technology. These are just a few quick things that I'll show. Again, thinking about the shared history of racialized capitalism. I love these images of Gordon Parks that speaks to racial segregation, but then also seeing how this speaks really in wider society through this view of minstrelsy, and superimposed here is the animated series, The Animaniacs. And within my own work, I'm always interested by this idea of how animation, through, say, the fact that the characters wear gloves and their faces really look like they're painted on, is this reproduction of racial minstrelsy before. So like in this view, if you think of the difference between the way Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd are animated, I think it more clearly shows that. Whereas, Alma is really quite humanized and personified, whereas Bugs, has this very sort of, he has the gloves, which are endemic of minstrelsy, and it really speaks to this Brer Rabbit history of storytelling. And then how does this relate to history in South Africa? And again, just quickly here, a difference between the promotional images of Uber Eats and the lived realities within sub-Saharan Africa. And finally, just a way of giving you an idea of how the work takes everything into consideration, the legalization of land and the lived reality of digital couriers and digital infrastructure, and how we see it. And I think that's it. So yeah, saying slide 47, I'll just stop sharing. And
thank you, Maxwell.
No, thank you.
That was brilliant. There's so much to unpack there. It's just fascinating, that whole thing about the couriers. Like, you see them so much, but you don't, we don't really think much about them, do we? Yeah. There was just two things that I wanted to pick up there. I mean, one of them is a little bit of a question.
Go ahead.
And one, I think, well, the two things that I wanted to pick up on was really around environmentalism. Well, that's a massive word, but the one thing that specifically we've been working on, and I've been working on with Gloria, is around bees as well. So we're working with a researcher at the University of Bangor in Wales who's doing some research around bees and whether they're affected by the electromagnetic fields of cellular and mobile phone towers. So it just made me think about the actual effect of that is not proved as yet, but it could be, and that's what they're trying to investigate. And if that is the case, then the effects of that on poverty and on the production of honey and allergies, even within children and adults all over the world, is huge. So that was just another angle that made me think about that.
I mean, I'm glad you brought it up. I think one thing that isn't thought about, and one thing that I'm very mindful of, is like the intersection between environmental injustice. So really, what does it mean if your workplace, and it isn't just 9 to 5, it's sort of let's say 7 to 9 or 4 a.m. as the Domino's ad speaks to. What does it mean if your workplace is in the street, right, exposed to the fumes of traffic, without the shelter of the built environment? Like, what does that mean to your health, right? And the questions of environmental justice are really determined by issues of racial segregation, right? So couriers in Europe and in the Americas are normally immigrants, right? And so how does the environment really come into play when one thinks of digital infrastructure and digital systems is, I think, very, very important to consider. That they really, all these questions get reproduced, right? So the environmental injustice of plantation agriculture, right, really is the same as the environmental injustice of digital infrastructures, as you've mentioned, cell phone towers, undersea cables that sort of speak to this, a lot of states, what do the Americans call it? They call it eminent domain, right? Where they take over the ownership of land to put down infrastructure, like, say, for example, the war between the United States and Mexico, and it really has a very critical effect on the migratory patterns of butterflies, going back to the American example of the wall, or just the health of and welfare of humans and the non-human. So yeah, that is all encompassing, and I think something that a lot of people don't really consider when they think of technology.
And I think we haven't got time to go into this now because we're just about to do a little break before our next session. But the other thing that that I picked up on, which is a whole other day of sessions, is really about the data. So you talked a lot about the changes within particularly urban setups like the milkman and lighting, and how different biases can be You know, at the beginning of the book by Cristina Criado Perez, where she talks about, you know, they were laughing, oh, snow clearing, is it in Sweden, couldn't possibly be sexist. And then they looked into it and it is. And I was just wondering about if you, I mean, I'm just interested in how data is collected.
So thanks for bringing that up, because I don't know if I mentioned it, because, you know, there were early conversations at the beginning of the day about, you know, what is coming out of the Americans. So I think, you know, text by, say, Safiya Noble, Algorithms of Oppression, or Ruha Benjamin, really speaks to this idea of, you know, it's really who collects the data. I think there's something that people, you know, so for me, behind the artificial in artificial intelligence, AI, is really the human, right? So who is determining what data is collected and how the data is used is so, so important. And that really comes through later on, or in the operation of platforms, or who uses them, or how they can use them, you know, how much they can earn, can they have a sustainable livelihood? And there's a lot of great work being done there. Within digital infrastructure, I think Lisa Parks out of MIT has done some also very interesting work with regards to that, looking at data systems, you know, because I mean, it's everyone thinks, oh yes, let's make it, let's digitize everything. And I understand why, because cities are meant to allow for the mitigation of, say, environmental damage through the agglomeration of people. Then you can create systems to share water. And informality really breaks that down because of the fact that it's disconnected. You don't have access to data. So there's a lot of really great work being done on the continent right now, which is all about data enumeration, really giving people the rights to their homes and their land by just, you know, jotting it down, like taking a survey of that to sort of say, this is who lives here, this is how long they've lived, this is the dimensions of their space. And then that's something that they can take to local municipalities to assert ownership.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, I'm going to have to stop us now, but I'm interested in that, in how many, groups of people that have been doing that for a long, long time in terms of taking their own data. And there's a lot of, we did a project around neurodiversity, so that, and this idea that people with autism specifically have, you know, these special interests that they call, and I don't want to use that language, but there were a lot of people we worked with who had these like huge collections of data for themselves or on themselves, that we don't really talk about or think about anymore in terms of our own.
I mean, the thing for me is that like there's some really great work by Ayana Roy and Neza Al-Sayed, which speaks to medieval modernity, right? And I think it's really important to really challenge standardization, right? Because this idea, especially say from my background in architecture, we have, you know, regulations of how high a handrail be, how wide a handrail be, what shape a handrail should be. And I get it, you know, health and safety, you know. But the truth is, you can't really reproduce those standardized systems universally. And in some cases, they are an impediment to development. And it's really sort of say, okay, is an incremental approach to regulation, and what is a non-standard approach to development, I think is really important. And to say technology, again, then, which, you know, I think is parallel to conversations about monopoly capital.